With all of this talk lately about scopes with paper-thin tubes and plastic turrets just breaking or malfunctioning if you look at them wrong, I want to explore the other side of this issue. And that's that people often falsely accuse scopes of being bad when they're not. Yep, you guessed it. Scopes are often the victims of false accusations. I've had countless of people bring scopes to me over the years that, claiming that it won't hold zero, it has a wandering zero, the turrets won't dial properly, or the reticle is screwed up on it. But much of the time, the scope turns out to be fine, and the real problem is underneath or behind the scope. In this video, I'll show you the most common issues people have with an otherwise mechanically sound scope. I'll also show you how to go through the process of elimination and how to correct most issues that scopes have. After watching this video, you should be able to determine if the issue's the scope, the rings, the bases, the rifle, or you. If you're having issues with accuracy or maybe reliability, the first thing you need to do is isolate the problem as either the rifle or the scope. And to do this is very easy. All you really need to do is remove the suspect scope and replace it with a second scope that's known to work properly. If the second scope works great, your issue was in the scope all along. If your second scope has the same exact problem as your first scope, then the issue is probably not with your scope. I've seen rings that were attached wrong or not fully seated into the grooves on the bases. I've seen scope bases that were loose or just poorly machined or incorrectly installed, or were just the wrong bases for the rifle. I've actually seen that. I've seen rifles where the receiver isn't in line with the bore. I know that sounds weird, but I've seen that issue actually quite often. I've also seen receivers with incorrectly drilled screw holes or uneven mating surfaces on the top of the receiver. Installing a good second scope is a good way to isolate your issue as being a scope issue or a rifle issue. So what I do is I shoot precise 10-shot groups with each scope and study the shot dispersion. And I'll elaborate more on this process later on in this video. Out of the box, a new scope should actually be broken in a little. This isn't as complicated as breaking in a new engine or breaking in a new barrel or even breaking in a new set of Kenetrek boots. All you need to do is to put some motion in the erector spring to settle it and spread some of the factory assembly lubricant around a little bit. So before you mount your scope, it's good to spin the turrets, halfway or more in either direction, to move the erector around and kind of settle the spring in there. In fact, it's good to move this a bunch of times before you actually even put it on the rifle. Next, it's good to move around the magnification ring, diopter assembly, and the focus knob, all the way in both direction, a whole bunch of times to properly spread out that factory lubricant in there and to settle all of the components in the scope into place. Most scopes settle in after you do this, initial break-in procedure. So if you mount your scope right out of the box, zero it with a few rounds, then your zero changes, it's usually because that scope needed a little bit of break-in before you installed it on the rifle. Because I have old eyes that just don't focus as fast as they used to, I can instantly tell when a reticle is out of focus. But young people with young eyes usually can't tell if a reticle is out of focus. You know, young eyes really can't do this efficiently because their eyes focus so fast. So younger people are usually unaware that their scope is even adjusted wrong. Then eventually they start having headache or eye fatigue issues. All rifle scopes have an adjustment ring on the ocular known as a diopter. The purpose of this is to bring the reticle into focus for your eyes. And this setting will be different for each individual's eye prescription. So in order to do this, you adjust the diopter ring all the way out. You turn the magnification all the way up. You turn the focus knob, if you have one on your scope, all the way to infinity. And you point the scope at a blank wall or cloudless sky or a white sheet of paper. And you're going to look through the reticle for 1 second at a time and then take it off. And as you do that, adjust the diopter in over and over until the reticle comes into perfect focus. And once this happens, this is basically your permanent diopter setting for your eyes until your vision eventually gets worse. The first thing I always suspect when people are claiming that their scope all of a sudden has really bad shot dispersion is parallax error. I can't count how many times I've had people say, this rifle isn't accurate anymore. Then I get behind their scope, adjust for parallax, and shoot an amazing group. I'm not going to give you a lecture about parallax. Just be mindful that you won't shoot tiny groups with a lot of parallax error in the scope. And regardless of what the experts try to tell you online, parallax error is actually a bigger problem at closer ranges than it is at extremely long ranges. To check for parallax, all you need to do is get behind the scope and move your head slightly without moving the rifle. And if the crosshair moves in relation to the target, you have parallax error, and that's not good. When you have a high magnification scope with a parallax knob on it, it's really easy to deal with parallax, but never trust the numbers on one of these side focus knobs or a parallax focus knob. Always dial parallax using your eyes, not the numbers on the scope. And of course, if you have a scope without parallax adjustment, maybe it's a fixed parallax scope fixed at like 100 or 150 yards. Those scopes, when you start getting out past about 250 yards, or even a really close shot on those, you're probably going to have to use scope shadow to remove parallax error out of the scope. And you can look up how to do that, but there's even a technique to take most of the parallax out of a fixed parallax scope. If you dial your turrets, but the reticle doesn't move, or if it gets really hard to turn your turrets, or you zero your scope and then all of a sudden have a huge impact shift, the problem might be that the erector assembly is bound up inside the tube because you maxed out travel. This is common on scopes that have been used and reused on several different rifles. When this happens, the first thing you should do is return your scope to what's called Optical Center. And all this requires is really a small mirror. Back in the day, we used to make these little V-notch jigs and put our scopes in them and spin them around and adjust to try to find optical center. But some genius out there found out that it's just as easy to do it with a small glass mirror. And to optically center your scope, all you need to do is place the objective on the mirror with a good light source overhead and turn your scope magnification down to the lowest setting. And that lowest setting will make kind of everything easier to see in the scope. And when you look into your scope, you'll see two sets of crosshairs. So adjust your windage and elevation until both the crosshairs kind of line up. When you do this, your scope will be very close to being optically centered, and you can then install it on your rifle. Now, if you optically center your scope and you still have to adjust your turret to maximum in order to zero it, you probably have a receiver to bore alignment issue. And this could be as simple as a loose or maybe poorly machined scope rail. And that's an easy fix. But it can also be misaligned screw holes on the receiver, or maybe you have an issue with how the top of the receiver is machined. And if this is the case, you'll have to return your rifle under warranty, or you'll end up taking it to a gunsmith. But sometimes your barrel is bent or installed at an angle, or the receiver face isn't square. If this is the case, your rifle either needs a new barrel or machine work done to the receiver to bring everything back into alignment. And this used to be a big problem with Remington 700s in the late 1990s. If the rifle shoots good, even though the bore is slightly misaligned or the receiver screw holes are just slightly off, some people get those rings with windage adjustment in them, or they use the Burr signature rings that have the little MOA shims that you put inside the rings. But neither of those, in my opinion, are good options, but people do it anyways. When a rifle scope slips in the rings, there's three possible issues that can cause that. The first issue might be clamping force. As the mass of an object increases, so does its inertia. So heavier scopes need more clamping force than lighter scopes. Clamping force can be achieved basically through more torque on the screws, or from wider rings with more screws on them. Just be careful not to exert too much force, too much clamping force, and distort the scope tube. It's real important, especially if you watched one of the videos I uploaded a couple of weeks ago about doing that. The second issue might be that the scope rings are not gripping enough surface area of the scope because your rings need to be lapped. Sometimes rings have, even quality rings, have little microscopic high or low spots in them that can cause issues. Trust me, lapping scope rings does solve a lot of issues, and many expensive scope rings need to be lapped, contrary to popular belief. And lastly, you might have oil or grease on your rings or on your scope tubes acting as a lubricant. And this will also cause the scope to slip within the rings. So always properly degrease rings and the scope tubes before you install your rings and scope. Sometimes you'll have rifle scope issues like maybe magnification adjustment issues or parallax issues that magically go away every time you remove your scope or loosen up your rings. This means that your rings are flexing out the scope tube every time you tighten them down. Here's an experiment for that. Get a laser bore sight, install it in your rifle, and zero your rifle to that dot. And when you do this, you need to make sure that the rifle is clamped down tight in a vise or some type of structure so it won't move at all. So after you put this in a vise and zero the reticle to the dot in the bore sight, what you're going to do is loosen up your rear ring where it attaches to the base right there. So if you do that and your reticle moves off the dot, if your reticle moves off zero, you have either a misaligned base or your rings are out of whack. Or maybe your receiver's not lined up with the bore. If it's just slightly misaligned, lapping the rings can often bring everything back true and take the stress off your scope. But if it's too bad, you might need new bases, or at worst, your receiver might be warped or have misaligned screw holes. If you properly set the diopter on a scope that has adjustable parallax and you can't get rid of the parallax, your scope probably is bad. If you adjust your magnification ring and nothing happens, your scope is probably bad. If your reticle is obviously crooked, your scope is probably bad. And all those things are really self-explanatory. And those things are really easy. So let's get into some scope issues that actually take some work to figure out. If you suspect scope tracking issues, I'll usually do a tall target test, but more importantly, I'll do a turret tracking test as well. In my opinion, a turret tracking test is good because it takes a lot of the shooting errors out of the equation when you're testing out a scope. But it's a complicated test to set up. You'll need a perfectly stable device that locks your scope down so it doesn't move at all while you're adjusting. I use a iron vise clamped to the table with a pick rail in the jaws. And this type of gunsmith vise has a ball head on it, so I could kind of move it around and adjust it to lock it in right there. And you'll also need the proper MOA or mil dot targets to use for the test. And you'll have to measure exactly from the center of the turret to this target with a long tape measure. You can't use, your standard laser rangefinder on it. It's not accurate enough. You actually need to tape out the distance on it. And of course you need to make sure this target is perfectly level. But this will let you know how well your turrets track and return to zero. The next test, for when you suspect your scope is having wandering zero or shot dispersion issues, is to get a good second scope to compare the suspect scope to. You're going to carefully shoot 10-shot groups with the same rifle using both scopes. In order to do this, you need to have a perfect shooting technique, a precise shooting rest or bipod, a really good rear bag, and all of the skill sets necessary to shoot tiny groups. Shooting off of sandbags or 2x4s will not give you precision here. If you don't have the equipment or skill to shoot precise groups, have someone else do this test for you. But basically what you do is you carefully shoot 10-shot groups with both scopes and let the barrel cool between shots. You aren't really looking for flyers here. You're looking at shot dispersion. If the group wanders, there's usually an issue with the scope. If the group dispersion is noticeably larger with the suspect scope than it is with the control scope, there's usually an issue as well. Erector assemblies kind of float around inside this tube right here and often deviate off of zero due to bad springs, turret issues, or even a lack of internal pressure. Sometimes taking everything apart and remounting your scope from the bases up can solve issues. This is especially true if you let some crackhead at a gun shop mount your scope for you. If you watched my video titled "Don't Destroy Your Scope," you saw that over-torqued rings can easily deform the tubes on some scopes, especially if the screws have oil or a thread locker on them. But sometimes you get lucky and over-torqued rings don't actually destroy your scope. It just binds up the internals in the scope a little bit, and often just loosening up the rings, degreasing them, lapping them, and reinstalling them to proper torque specs will fix the issue. And sometimes you get lucky like that. Also, maybe the rings weren't seated fully forward in the rail. That's often a problem. Or maybe, your base was loose, or one of the screws in the base was bottoming out in the action. Often, going back to square one and doing a full reinstall is the right thing to do. And I find that most of the time, this actually fixes a lot of issues. The last problem with trying to shoot a highly precise group is a problem that most people don't want to hear. And I know a lot of people on this channel aren't going to want to hear this, but most people simply don't know how or aren't properly equipped to shoot small groups with a rifle. Hate to say that, but it's true. And when that happens, the ammo, the rifle, and ultimately the scope usually gets the blame for it. I understand practical accuracy in the field and practicing from field positions. I'm a huge proponent of that. But when you're zeroing a rifle, doing load development, or testing out scope function, accuracy from the bench is actually extremely important, and most people aren't capable of doing that. Also, shooting from different positions or using different rests or even putting pressure on the rifle different ways will cause impact shifts. And these impact shifts are also usually blamed on the scope. For instance, if you're shooting off of a bag versus a bipod, you're probably going to have a little bit of a different point of aim, point of impact. Also, a bag like this, that people go down to Walmart or something and buy, is never going to be as precise as shooting off of a system like this. But even if you have a system like this, if I'm shooting a flat profile target or tactical rifle, and I put it into this round bag right here, it's not going to shoot very precisely. I need a flat bag for that. And conversely, if I try to shoot a rounded front end lightweight hunting rifle on this flat base right here, I'm also probably not going to shoot very precise groups. Then you get into rear bags, which if you're not using a really good heavy rabbit ear rear bag, you're probably also not shooting very precise groups. So, all of this comes into play. And to add to this, you need to have good shooting technique. You need to know how to shoot at a free recoil with a lighter, and you could do that with a lighter recoiling cartridge, but some of the big heavy kickers in a lightweight hunting rifle, you're going to have to kind of hold that stock and control that a little bit, but you got to be repeatable and consistent with that hold in order to get good groups. Trigger control, getting behind the scope, taking parallax out. There's a lot of technique involved also with shooting good groups, and most people don't possess that knowledge or skills. But many years ago, I had a guy complaining to me that his Garand didn't shoot worth a shit. He'd zero it perfectly, and then it would shoot like crap during competitions. Well, what I found out was that he zeroed that M1 Garand off the bench, then shot groups prone using a sling for tension. And that caused him to shoot 4 or 5 inches to the left every time. So people do similar things like this all the time and immediately blame it on the scope. I've definitely had my share of bad or broken scopes over the years, and people who claim the opposite probably haven't been hunting for very long. A scope is a complicated machine with small moving parts and fragile glass inside of it. So fully trusting any scope is kind of stupid. You know, they're all prone to failure like any machine is. But quite honestly, in my experience, the human machine is more prone to failure. You know, I'm sure you noticed that my last two videos put some scopes in kind of a bad light. But in this video, I actually came to their defense. You'll only experience an optics roller coaster ride like that on Desert Dog Outdoors. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video about troubleshooting rifle scope issues. You can reach me with any questions or comments at desertdogoutdoors@gmail.com. Thank you for watching, and as always, good hunting.